Mark shoved my gray suitcase out to the doorway as if it were something blocking his path. The metal hit the wooden floor with a sharp, cold sound. He straightened up, didn't hesitate for even a second, and said in a flat voice so emotionless, I thought I misheard him. My company and my life don't need you anymore. I didn't even get a full breath in before he set another sheet of paper on top of the suitcase. A termination letter. The company logo sat in the top left corner. The same company that ran on the software I'd built from the very first lines of code. A small detail, but it felt like someone had just locked the door to a room I'd spent 3 years building. I stood on the porch, my hands going numb because I didn't know what I was supposed to hold on to first, the suitcase, the letter, or whatever was left of myself. And the sun was still rising, the morning light still that soft, pale gold like any other day. Only my life sounded like it was dropping down a floor. I didn't cry. I just stood there, like my mind needed to rewind everything to understand that I'd just been kicked out of my own home by the man who once told me, no one gets me the way you do. And that's when the memories came back. Not the good ones, but the pieces I'd brushed aside for months. That day, I was in the small room next to the kitchen. The old wooden desk barely had enough space for a laptop and 3 notebooks. I'm Emily, a software engineer who likes to break every idea into small blocks and fit them together like Lego. Every night I sat there until 1 or 2 in the morning, debugging lines of code no one but me fully understood. I never asked for the spotlight. I liked working in a quiet space like that. Every time I got a new feature to run, I just open the door and tell Mark, it's working. He'd nod, sometimes say, good job, then go right back to his screen. Mark, my husband, was the ambitious type, reserved, always looking further than what he already had. He believed he was born to succeed in a big way. I thought that was what I loved about him, until that ambition swallowed whatever kindness he still had. I remember one evening when Mark invited a few old friends over for dinner. I made lasagna. He set out a few bottles of wine. The conversation eventually shifted to his company. Someone asked how he landed his first contract. Mark laughed, raised his glass, and said, thanks to my vision, I knew exactly what the market needed. That was it. Not a single word about the software I wrote, not even a glance in my direction. I just smiled, not because I didn't care, but because I was used to being the one behind the scenes. Still, that night was the first time I felt pushed out of place, right inside my own home. And then Grace walked in. She was late because she was stuck at the office. Grace was Mark's colleague, sharp, quick-talking, always knowing how to draw attention. I didn't know much about her before that, but when she looked at Mark, there was something too familiar in her eyes, like they'd shared more than meetings. While I cleared the table, I heard Mark going on about his expansion strategy. I looked at him, then at Grace. She was leaning slightly back in her chair, smiling at him, the kind of smile women give to someone they think matters. It only lasted a few seconds, but I felt a small crack like hearing glass tremble, even when you can't see it breaking. I told myself, I must be tired. I must be overthinking. I'd said that to myself far too many times. I went back to the porch, where the suitcase still sat like proof of everything I'd tried to ignore. Mark stood a few steps away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He wasn't regretful. Just decisive, like someone who'd chosen a direction and knew I wasn't part of it. Take it, he said, pointing at the paper. Everything has to be professional now. And you're no longer a fit for the company. His voice was painfully ordinary. Ordinary in a way that scared me. I bent down to pick up the paper. In that moment, one clear thought rose in my mind. This has been wrong for a long time. I just didn't want to call it what it was. I looked at Mark one last time, and right behind him, through the open doorway, I saw Grace walk quickly across the living room with a stack of documents in her hand. She glanced at me, offered a polite smile, But underneath it was something else, a confidence, or the relief of someone who knew her place had already been secured. That vague smile closed the moment, not with a clear truth, but with the first signal I had ignored for far too long. Grace smiled at Mark in the doorway that day, and when the door closed in front of me, the strange thing was that I didn't feel angry right away. I just felt empty. But that emptiness stayed with me the next morning when I woke up early to make breakfast and opened my laptop like always, and trying to hold on to my routine to remind myself I still had a life of my own. I freelanced for a few small projects, mostly optimizing algorithms for data analysis apps. The work gave me room to breathe, but it also let me help Mark whenever he needed to tweak a demo or tighten up the software. I was used to the rhythm, opening the windows early, prepping food for the day, driving along clean suburban roads, and working in that little room by the kitchen. Mark left the house before I did. He always said he wanted to get into the flow earlier than everyone else. I respected that, even though in the past few months, that flow seemed to carry him farther and farther away. That afternoon, I stopped by Mark's office to drop off the report he'd asked for. It was a 3-story tech workspace, always full of keyboard clacking, to printer noise, and the plasticky smell of new equipment they kept ordering. I knew the place like a second home, even though I never truly belonged there. Mark was in a meeting. I stood outside looking through the frosted glass. He was speaking confidently, pointing at the screen where the software demo was running. I recognized it immediately, the newest version, the one I had updated just 3 days earlier, the same version I'd told him wasn't ready to be shown yet, because it still needed stability fixes. I stayed there for a few minutes, feeling like I'd just been pushed one step further away from the thing I created. When the meeting paused, Mark stepped out. He looked at me as if he'd forgotten I was supposed to stop by. "Here's your report," I said. "Yeah, just leave it," he replied quickly, eyes still on his phone. "I'm busy pitching. I don't have time for small details right now." Small details? Did he mean my software? Or me? I didn't ask. I just watched. Mark's change didn't arrive with a loud crash. It came in tiny pieces, falling one after another, and I hadn't noticed. That night, Mark came home later than usual. I asked if he was okay, and he said, "Getting ready to pitch to a big investor. You don't understand this kind of pressure." I made dinner. He ate quickly, answering emails, nodding without listening. When I asked if he wanted me to check the algorithm again for the demo, he waved me off. "No need. I'll go over it with Grace. She's been helping me a lot." Grace's name was coming up more and more. The next evening, when I checked my private code repo, I found that Mark had copied the entire newest version without asking, the version I had never approved for use. It felt like someone pulled a chair out from under me. I called him right away. "You use the new build?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," he said shortly. "Gotta show investors the best version. And besides, you're just support anyway." I froze. Support? For 3 years, every line of code, every prediction model, every optimization algorithm came from the nights I spent building it. But Mark didn't say it to hurt me. That made it worse. He said it like it was simply the truth. In those few minutes, I realized my husband had started living in a story where he was the only main character. A few days later, I went to the office again, this time to return the equipment he'd borrowed for rehearsal. When I walked into the conference room, I saw Grace standing beside Mark, adjusting the mic on his collar. Her touch was light, like she'd done it many times before. Grace saw me first. She gave me a polite smile, the kind of smile from someone who knows she's in the better position and doesn't need to say it out loud. "Emily, you're here to drop off the equipment, right?" she asked. Her voice was light, but a little too high, like she was the one running the room. I nodded and set the equipment on the table. Mark thanked me, but his voice had none of the familiarity it used to. He went right back to the rehearsal slides, letting Grace adjust the audio channel, even though I knew she didn't actually understand the technical side. From the corner of the room, I watched quietly, not out of jealousy, but because, for the first time, I saw myself slipping off the edge of a picture whose background I had painted. Grace was becoming his new right hand. That much was clear every time I came by the office. The staff greeted her with the kind of respect they used to give Mark. And Mark? He seemed perfectly comfortable letting her step into the space he once reserved for me. As I left the conference room, I overheard them talking about the presentation. Mark said, "Grace gets my vision fast. Having someone like that really takes the pressure off." I didn't react. I just noted it, quietly, like someone dropping a stone into a lake, not to make waves, but to mark that the bottom was shifting. That night, I sat in my old workspace at home. The desk lamp reflected off my stack of daily notes. I looked at the scribbles and the ideas that once excited me enough to stay up until morning. Now I looked at them with a strange feeling, like they no longer belonged to me. I wasn't thinking about betrayal. Not yet. But for the first time, I faced the truth that Mark was slowly pushing me out of the circle I helped build. I closed my laptop, and the soft click told me everything. A fracture had formed, not big, but big enough that I felt it every time I breathed. In the days that followed, I began to see the empty spaces where Mark had quietly kept me out. Not a dramatic moment, just a series of small actions, one after another, like someone was closing doors right in front of me. That morning, Mark left earlier than usual. He said he had the final prep meeting for the investor pitch. I wished him luck. He nodded without looking at me. When the door closed, and the house felt so quiet I could hear the fan in my workspace spinning, I opened my computer, planning to review the final algorithm version Mark had asked me to check. But the commercialization document, the one I'd always had access to, was suddenly gone from the shared folder. I checked again and again, then tried the search tool. Nothing. Even the draft I created had been deleted. I texted Mark. He only replied, "The documents are being handled internally. You don't need to worry about that part." It wasn't the first time he'd said that, but it was the first time I felt he was deliberately keeping me out of a major step. That afternoon, I went to Mark's office to drop off the final performance report for the algorithm. At the front desk, the receptionist said, "The pitch has already started. You're not on the list." Emily. I stood there in the lobby, gripping the folder in my hand. I'd never missed a single pitch in the last 3 years. Even if I wasn't on stage, I was always the one behind the scenes fixing the demo if something went wrong. But this time, they didn't need me. I walked up to the second floor where the main conference room lights were on. I looked through the glass. Mark stood in the center, presenting about the company, the future, the groundbreaking tech platform. Grace stood beside him, forwarding the slides, nodding every time he emphasized a point. I watched them for a few seconds. Just a few. But enough to understand that my role was becoming unnecessary in a way no one would ever say out loud. I turned to leave, and my phone buzzed with a new email. A big client asking about the algorithm. Yeah, but the reply wasn't from me. It was from Grace. She'd answered using terminology she didn't understand, actually misunderstood, but Mark had let her handle it. My chest tightened, not from anger, but from realizing I was being replaced, one piece at a time. That night, Mark came home late. I didn't ask how the pitch went. He didn't volunteer anything. We ate in silence until he set his knife down and said, "You need to understand this is business, not about personal effort." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You're too sensitive," he said, in the tone of someone teaching me how to be an adult. "I need someone who puts the bigger picture above their feelings." The irony was that for 3 years, I had put the bigger picture first. I'd always put the company before myself. And now that was the excuse he used to push me aside? I didn't answer. I just let his words hang in the air between us. Part of me wanted to fight back, but the calmer part knew anything I said right then would be dismissed as emotional. The days that followed were a string of moments separate, but all pointing to the same feeling of being pushed out of the world I helped build. Scene 1. I was sitting in a small meeting room, the same one where Mark and I used to brainstorm for hours. The staff had called me in, assuming I was still the technical advisor, but 10 minutes later, Grace walked in and said, "Oh, I'm handling this part. Emily doesn't need to be here." I smiled and stepped out, but inside I wondered, since when did she have the authority to decide who stayed? Scene 2. I walked down the hallway and saw Mark and Grace coming out of the presentation room together. They were talking softly, leaning in toward each other like people used to sharing something important. Mark didn't see me. Or maybe he did and chose not to stop. Scene 3. I stepped into Mark's office to hand him a report. He quickly shut his laptop like there was something on it I wasn't supposed to see. Not betrayal, no obvious sign of it, but the way he hid it. It was enough to tell me I was no longer allowed in that space. Each moment was small, but when you string them together, they say more than any explanation ever could. And then came the moment that changed everything. That day, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I was planning to give Mark an algorithm tweak I thought might help with the next pitch. When I walked past the small meeting room at the end of the hall, I heard his voice. The door was slightly ajar. "If I don't have this software, I have nothing to negotiate with." I stopped. My hand tightened around the folder without me thinking. I held my breath and listened. Grace responded, her voice soft but certain. "And once the deal is done, you won't need anyone else." Anyone else. Those two words cut through me faster than any obvious betrayal ever could. Not because Mark wanted me out of the work, but because he had already factored me out of his entire future, neatly, without emotion, like clearing out an expired item. I stood outside the meeting room, looking through the small gap in the door. Mark was bent over the documents, not hesitating at all. Grace stood beside him, arms loosely crossed, or looking like part of a plan they had crafted together. I didn't walk in. I didn't confront them. I didn't run away. I just stood there. For the first time in months, I didn't tell myself I was being too sensitive. I took note. I noted Mark's expression. I noted Grace's tone. I noted my place in the picture, outside the door. And in that moment, I knew I had stepped into a different phase of the story, not through action, but through awareness. Awareness that I was no longer part of any future Mark was planning. The day Mark's company closed the big deal, I didn't hear it from him. I heard it from an internal email that was accidentally sent to me. The subject line read, "Congratulations on the successful acquisition." I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then closed it. And it wasn't until that evening that Mark came home, his face glowing with that familiar kind of confidence. He set his keys on the table and said quietly, "I'm officially a millionaire." I congratulated him. He nodded, but his eyes didn't stay on me for more than a second. The next morning, he called me into his office. His voice was calm, polite, and held not a trace of gratitude for the 3 years I spent building the company's tech foundation. "Emily," he began, "from now on, you don't need to be involved in the project anymore. The new team is capable. Grace will replace you." That sentence wasn't sharp. It was hollow, like he'd rehearsed it long ago. I looked at him for a few seconds and realized he didn't waver at all. In Mark's eyes, Todd removing me from the very software I built was simply the final optimization before he stepped into his next chapter. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just said, "Okay." Strange how a cut can feel so weightless. Mark thought my okay was the end of me. But he forgot one thing: root access. The master level permissions he once told me to keep to avoid security risks. I had never used it. Not once. Until now. 2 weeks after Mark became a millionaire, he was getting ready to sign a market expansion contract with a larger corporation. A deal big enough to double his net worth in a matter of months. The whole system was open, every license active, and the signing event was being live-streamed to partners. I sat in my old workspace, opened the admin interface only I had the master code for. My hands didn't shake. I wasn't angry. I was still. I looked at the list of licenses, hundreds of them, each one representing a partner Mark had pitched, all glowing green. I placed my fingers on the keyboard, took a long breath, and selected Lock All Licenses. The signal went through in less than a second. On the system dashboard, every license flipped to red at the same time. In Mark's office, I could imagine the chaos starting, the demo crashing, the platform failing to launch, access documents getting denied, and most importantly, the partners sitting right there watching a multi-million-dollar system collapse in front of them. Mark called me less than 5 minutes later. I didn't answer. That night, the company's valuation plummeted. Internal reports flew everywhere. Investors pulled back. Mark's shares were frozen. In a single night, the man who had just become a millionaire turned into someone who had to explain himself to the board. As for me, I simply shut my laptop, stood up from the desk, and went to bed earlier than usual. The next morning, when I stepped outside for a walk around the neighborhood, Mark was standing in front of my house. The certainty in his eyes had faded. For the first time in months, he looked real. "Emily," he said, his voice rough, "you have to fix this. You know the system better than anyone." I stood 3 steps away from him, far enough to see the panic in his eyes clearly. "You crashed the company," he went on. "No one can handle the software like you. I need you." Need. A word he hadn't used in years, now dropping out of his mouth heavy as stone. I looked at him long enough that he had to swallow, waiting. Finally, I said softly, "This is what happens when you cut out the person who built the foundation." No raised voice, no anger, just the truth he refused to face. Mark opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. He looked like a man trying to hold up a massive building without realizing the ground beneath it was already gone. He didn't cry. Mark was never the type. But the collapse in his eyes was clearer than any tears. Grace was sitting in a car by the curb. She watched us for a few seconds before turning away and calling someone, her voice urgent but not hesitant, not confused. A few minutes later, she got into another, nicer car and drove off without looking back. That was when Mark understood he hadn't just lost the company. He'd lost the only ally he thought he still had. He turned to me again, as if hoping I'd say something that could help him stand, but I didn't. I didn't explain. I didn't recount anything. I just stepped down the porch, walked past him, and went on with my morning. The wind moved gently through the trees in front of the house. I heard my own footsteps more clearly than his voice calling after me. I didn't turn back. After that morning, when Mark stood outside my house with panic in his eyes, my life shifted into a different rhythm. Not faster, just quieter. Mark's life, though, moved in the opposite direction. In the first few days, he called nonstop. The phone buzzed so much I had to switch it to silent. When I didn't answer, he sent emails, dozens of them. Long explanations about how everything was a misunderstanding, how the company needed me, how he needed me. I read them, but didn't reply. Not because I wanted revenge, but because every line he wrote came from desperation, not clarity. Then he went to my parents' house. My dad said Mark stood outside the door for a long time, saying he just wanted to talk to me. I nodded when he told me, not wanting my parents tangled in this. I knew Mark wasn't looking for me out of love. He was looking for me because he'd lost the foundation he thought he had built himself. Rumors about the company spread quickly in the tech world. Articles questioned Mark's leadership. Partners said they felt deceived. The stock value plunged without slowing. I didn't feel triumphant, but I didn't step in to save anything either. I had poured years into that foundation. He was the one who tore it apart. I decided to leave the city for a while. I booked tickets to Seattle, then Los Angeles, then Boston. In each place, I stayed a few days, walked around, watched people rushing through their lives, and felt myself slowly slipping free from the whirlwind that had been dragging me down for years. In every city, I joined tech workshops I'd always wanted to attend, but never had time for. I met new people, people who saw me not through Mark, not through the company, but through the ideas I shared. They asked about my algorithms, about the prediction models I'd built, and for the first time in a long while, I talked about my work with simple joy. No one tried to push me aside. No one said I was too sensitive. No one dismissed my contributions. I existed fully, not minimized, not shoved to the edge. One evening in Chicago, I opened my laptop and started sketching out a personal project. Not to get back at Mark, not to prove anything, just because I wanted to create something that was mine. I named the project, built the folder structure, wrote the first lines of code. The keystrokes sounded steady, light, like my heartbeat finally settling again. This freedom wasn't loud. It came in small moments, choosing my own hotel, sitting in a workshop jotting notes with my favorite highlighter, standing in a long line for a museum ticket without having to time anything around someone else's pitch prep. I realized I had never truly lived my own life until now. Another evening, on the 20th floor of a hotel in San Francisco, I stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. Traffic trails glowed like long ribbons, each one telling its own story. The wind was cold but gentle. I leaned against the railing, took a slow breath, and in that moment, one truth became clear, a truth I should have seen long ago. I never needed Mark to succeed. I had just forgotten that because I got used to letting him stand in front. That realization didn't taste bitter. It felt light, like setting something down after carrying it for far too long. The next morning, just as I stepped into the hotel lobby, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Mark. A nearly full-page apology. Sorry for treating me badly. Sorry for not giving me credit. Sorry for letting someone influence him. Sorry for losing me. He said he was ready to fix everything, that he wanted me to come back. I read slowly. Every apology was accurate, but accurate didn't mean enough. I replied with one single sentence. I'm not going back to someone who forgets gratitude. I set the phone on the table without waiting for his next message. I didn't need to know how he reacted. Some people only learn when they lose what they assumed would always be there. I didn't blame Mark anymore, but that didn't mean I would return. That afternoon, I rented a car and drove out of the city. The highway stretched wide under a blue sky, low mountains in the distance softened by a thin layer of haze. I rolled down the window and let the wind rush in. Something in that wind made me feel like I was stepping into a new chapter, one with no one standing in front to lead the way. Just me. I didn't know where I'd stop next. Maybe a small town in the Nevada desert. Maybe a coastal city in Florida. Maybe anywhere I felt like going. What mattered was this. I chose the direction myself. I looked at the road ahead, sunlight glinting off the windshield. I felt light, as if I'd finally handed my life back to myself. And if someone asked whether I regretted anything, I'd say no. I only wished I had left sooner. The wind skimmed across my hand as I held it out the window. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me. So did my life. Right before I pressed the gas a little more, I asked myself, and I want my viewers to ask themselves too, would you forgive someone who used you to climb to the top, then left you behind? I genuinely want to know how you would handle it. Leave me a comment. That's the end of the story. Thank you for staying with me through all of it.